broadcast button and start right now. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. My name is Cynthia Gordigiwa, and I'm the Marketing Director at ProPublica. I'm here to welcome you while we connect everyone who signed up for the event. We'll get started in a moment as soon as we have a critical mass of attendees on. Today's event, by the way, is co-sponsored by the Pulitzer Center and the New York Times Magazine. We're going to be taking a closer look at a few recent stories from ProPublica, some co-published with the New York Times Magazine with support from the Pulitzer Center. We've been looking at the effects of climate change through a couple of different lenses, the wildfires burning in the West, as well as what happens when certain areas become uninhabitable. People move. We'll hear from reporters who worked on those stories, as well as the scientists who led the data on our climate migration series. And I'll introduce everyone in just a moment. It looks like we have enough folks on to get started now, so let's get into it. Again, for those just hopping on, my name is Cynthia Gordigiwa. I'm the Marketing Director at ProPublica. I hope you've had a chance to read the stories our panelists will be discussing today. This year, ProPublica, in partnership with the New York Times Magazine, has been examining climate change and its effects on the movements of communities in the US and across the world. We did that with support from the Pulitzer Center, which is a nonprofit journalism organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. They do this through the direct support of quality journalism and through education, working with schools and universities to bring those issues into classrooms. The center was founded in 2006 and is the largest single source of money for global enterprise reporting. ProPublica has also looked into wildfires in the West, specifically how they relate not only to climate change, but years of policy decisions. So here to talk about all of this today, we have our esteemed panel, Elizabeth Weil, ProPublica's reporter on California and climate, Abram Lustgarten, ProPublica's senior environmental reporter behind the ambitious climate migration series. We're also joined by Brian Jones, a geographer and assistant professor at Baruch College. Much of his current research addresses climate-induced migration, and Brian worked with us to develop a mathematical model to forecast the effects of climate change on the movements of communities. And we have our moderator, ProPublica editor-in-chief, Stephen Engelberg. Our panelists will also be answering your questions. If you'd like to submit a question at any time, click the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen to type it in, and we'll get to those during the Q&A. But first, I'll throw it over to ProPublica editor-in-chief, Stephen Engelberg. Stephen?
Welcome, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. I'd like to get right into it. I'd like to begin with a fact that is kind of shocking. 3/4 of Americans tonight are supposedly going to watch the presidential debate. There are going to be, I think, 6 different topics under discussion in that debate. Not one of them is climate change. So somehow we're going to have this epical showdown watched by everybody in the most closely contested election in recent memory, and not one word about climate change. So we will try to make up for that a bit here today to at least set some of the parameters of the issues. And I'd like to start with some specific things and then kind of move to the broader pattern. So in specific things, our very own Liz Weil, who covers California climate, began a very well-timed set of research on forest fires. And we've all seen what's happening in California. Before Liz, I put the question to you, I'd like to get a little report from Abram. Abram, I see you're in a closed room with the curtains drawn. You're in California. How is the climate where you are in terms of fires?
Well, Liz isn't that far away, but the climate is not great. So as of the last couple of days, we have 2 very large zero containment fires. The closest evacuation zone, I think, is about 35 or 40 miles from here. So the air is smoky, the sun is bright orange behind the clouds, and we're sort of heading into round 2 of bad wildfire season, the first round being a couple weeks ago.
And what is the measurement of this? How do you measure that?
Well, we use an air quality index, and 0 through 50 is healthy. 50 to 100 is, sort of a hazard for unhealthy groups and or sensitive groups, and above 100 is just plain hazardous. And we're at about 110 at the moment.
So, Liz, how did this happen, and why does it keep happening?
Small question. It happened for a big combination of reasons. So first of all, fire is healthy in California. The landscape here is supposed to burn. So fire in and of itself is not the problem. The problem starts when we multiply in other factors. So as we all know, California is getting hotter and drier. So the pattern that we have every year where it rains in the fall and winter, it grows in the spring, it dries in the summer and burns in the fall. Now it's a lot hotter and drier. So there's a lot more burning. But we humans, through our policy decisions, have really exacerbated that. And we've done that in two main ways. So there is forest management. There is basically, how have we taken care of our forests? What have we done to them? And basically what we've done is we've prevented them from burning in healthy ways. And we've done this for 100 years. And we've done this by caring about extraction. And we've done this by being afraid of fire. And we've done this because we don't like smoke. And we've done this because the indigenous populations that were here that had a very healthy relationship to fire are not taking care of those landscapes anymore. And the other thing that we've done is we have moved out all over California, sort of nestled among the forests and the grasslands, and living in those areas has also created a lot more fire. People ignite almost all of the wildfires in California. And when there are people in those landscapes, it becomes much harder to do the prescribed burns that we would do to keep those forests healthy. And then once fires start, they become a lot harder to fight.
Oh, that sounds horrible. So I hear you saying two things. Number one, our sort of policies and habits and where we live and how we live. And number two, climate change. If you were trying to apportion those in a pie chart, which I know is impossible, do you have a sense of which is the more powerful driving force here?
You know, I think that's an impossible question to answer. I don't have a pie chart for you, but we do know that we can make inroads and affect policy and affect where we live a lot more easily than we can change what the climate is doing. And so in terms of what we're going to do about it, of course, we need to look at the big picture, but there are solutions that are much more manageable that we could be addressing that we haven't very well.
What's it going to take? I mean, how much of California do you have to burn down before this gets under control? And when I say burn down, I mean prescribed burns, controlled burns, not the out of control things we're seeing now.
You know, I think like Abram mentioned, I think we're getting closer. That these fires not only are the second big round this year, the fires that we're seeing now are burning again in communities that had horrible fires 2 and 3 years ago. And I think there's a growing sense in California that like we've all seen this movie and we've seen it in these towns. And while we're all terrified and appalled, nobody is really surprised. And I think that feeling of not being surprised, of knowing that we know better, is inching us towards being finally ready to do something about it.
Although just to I want to get Bram in here, but that something could mean, right, that people can't just live in the middle of the woods forever. People may have to leave where they are. Do you imagine that's a possible thing, that people would give up their house or their nice tree-lined street?
Sure, I think it's a far more likely outcome that we'll see programs in place to help people protect their homes first. Before we tell everybody they have to move, we will hopefully tell everybody how to be a lot safer where they are. But there are also insurance policies that are getting dropped and lots of other factors that are going to nudge people to move on their own without, you know, big G government coming in and telling everybody they have to go. So I do think there is pressure in many ways for people to live in safer places, in safer ways.
So let me turn to Abram and Brian. So that seems like a very human thing, right? The land around you is on fire. It's becoming very harsh. Liz has posited that at some point even Californians might leave. But it sounds like we're not quite like everybody else. So I'd like to hear how you guys thought about migration. And do Americans behave like other people?
Let me take a step back for a second. I mean, fires are one aspect of the climate threat, but around the world, it's going to get hotter. It's going to get drier. The sea levels are rising. Crops will be failing, making it harder to grow food and support large, populations. So, before I'll come back to the United States in just a minute, but I'm going to show a screen of one of the basis for my research was some research done by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year, and they tried to map or come up with a measure for where people live on the planet. And they basically found that for the last 6,000 years, the ideal temperature and precipitation provided a living area for most of the planet's population, and only about 1% of the planet lives outside of that ideal niche for human habitation. But what's changing right now with climate change is that 1% is becoming close to 20%. It is going to become too hot and too dry to grow food and to live comfortably. And what that basically means is that globally, a third of the planet, maybe 2 to 3 billion people, will confront these climate changes in a way that will either force them to live in a place that's historically outside the realm of human habitability, or to move. So when Brian and I start to think about human migration, that's what's driving that question of where will people go. And Steve, you asked about the United States, and this is a mapping project that we did to apply some of that same data and other data to the United States to see what it means for us. So we might not be here in the most extreme realm of change like North Africa, for example, but you can see on this map of the United States that the dark green areas are kind of ideal human habitability niche now. And as time goes by, that niche is moving forward. And with more emissions, it moves far northward up towards the Canadian border, and you start to see big gaps, and you see them here on the south coast and in the southeast and all through the southwest, where people are more or less Americans are more or less going to be moving outside of the realm of what's historically habitable. This is a map of heat change in the United States. I'm just going to blow through these really quickly, but just to give an idea of how the United States changes. So the south of the country is going to get hot. The Midwest part of the country and the Mississippi River Valley is going to get extremely hot and humid to the degree that it's dangerous to work outdoors or to play sports outdoors, what they call wet bulb temperature. This is what Liz is talking about. I mean, this is the United States fire risk. And you see that, not only will California have extreme mega fires going into the next couple of decades, but most of the West will, but not only the West, but South Florida and parts of the Southeast and Georgia and the Carolinas will experience major fires. This is the incursion of the coastlines by sea level rise in the United States. And the purple here on this map is where we'll see crop failures. And so parts of Texas, for example, will see up to a 90% decrease in their ability to grow crops like corn and soy. And that failure will, extend well up through the high plains and the breadbasket of the United States. So, where this is a multi-front assault on where we live geographically. And I think, so we've been, drawn to this question of globally, where will people move and what does that mean for geopolitical relations as people move across borders in response to changing climate? In the United States, where does that mean that we'll go to if we don't like living in smoke here in California, where the fires get worse for a mixture of reasons, and you move to Texas? Are you any better off, or are you going to be pushed further north? And I think that we'll see over many decades, but a real transformation over the next 50, 60 years of people basically moving northwards and towards the Northeast in the United States and generally across the globe, a movement northwards out of those hot and dry areas.
You're muted, Stephen.
Yeah. Coming back to the question of, you did two different things. Let's start with the sort of international one. Brian, you worked in Abram and a whole bunch of other people to try to imagine what this looks like on an international basis. Talk a little bit about what some of the variables are. So what makes it better? What makes it worse? What do we see as the crucial drivers in this formula? Not formula, model. It's not a formula, it's a model. So to talk about what you saw as the crucial factors.
Sure. And again, let me step back here for a moment and separate a country like the United States from some of the other countries that we discussed. And you mentioned this earlier, Stephen. Do Americans act like people in other countries vis-a-vis the decision to move as a function of environmental factors? And the answer to that question is no, not yet at least. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I'll come back to in a moment. But the modeling process is challenging for a variety of reasons, not least of which is we don't actually have very good data regarding migration, not only for environmental reasons, but for any reason from country to country and certainly within countries. So we have to come up with ways to try and figure out what is actually happening across the surface of the earth. And the way we're able to do that is by looking at census type data. And if we know how population is changing in terms of its spatial distribution over time, and we know what birth rates look like, and we know what mortality looks like, well, then any change that's not accounted for by birth rates or mortality is a function of migration. And then we take that information and we're looking for mathematical regularities in the relationship between the change in population distribution and changing in different socioeconomic and environmental type factors across the landscape. So the big driver is and always has been economic in nature. That is wage rate differentials or job opportunities. And this remains the largest driver of migration, both in a country like the United States and in developing countries that are at the moment more hard hit by climate. But the challenging part becomes, how do you tease out the effect that the environment is actually having on the economic livelihoods that sustain many of the populations we're interested in, like agriculture, for example. Ultimately, there comes a point where environmental change is such that certain agricultural livelihoods are no longer tenable. And really what we're trying to do is project these conditions forward, or we're taking projections of these conditions forward in conjunction with the mathematical relationships that we isolate on movement of the population relative to the health of different sectors of the larger agricultural sector, to see how it impacts the spatial distribution of the population. We see the effects already in many parts of the world, like Central America, parts of Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent. In the US, however, we are still moving towards danger, not away from it. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves going forward.
Abram, Liz, I'd like to hear about that as Californians. We're moving towards danger as opposed to away from it. I think you guys out there are kind of like leading the way. Why?
Abram?
Well, I'll go first. I don't think Californians are leading the way. I think Floridans are leading the way, and Arizona residents are leading the way. We've as a population, as a country, and we've moved to the places most at risk, the coastlines that we know are going to increasingly be hammered by hurricanes, the desert environments that we know don't have water and are going to be unbearably hot. And we've done that because we have policies in place that incentivize that movement. I mean, I don't think that Americans would put themselves, right in the barrel sights of worsening hurricanes if they didn't have really cheap and affordable, legally mandated insurance that makes it possible for them to replace their homes if they get destroyed. Or,
is that Florida you're talking about?
That's Florida, which has had a state-run private housing insurance policy that the state itself created after insurers decided that they would no longer insure residences in the state after Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Similarly, the federal government has piped water into the city of Phoenix, Arizona, making it, a habitable place. And, Californians have grown and sprawled our urban areas as well, pressing into what they call wildland urban interface and, into danger zones that are more susceptible to fire. Just the sheer population growth of the state has participated in that. But it's a national phenomenon. I don't think one unique to California.
Sure.
Liz, what about, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, what about the fires? Ron mentions the insurance policies in the state of Florida is encouraging people to stay because, of course, you can get your house taken care of at a cheap rate. Well, how do the insurance policies work for fire in California?
Well, a lot of Californians are getting dropped by their insurance policies. So that's one factor. But relative to the economics, the National Bureau of Economics Research published this paper last year relative to firefighting, which was very interesting on this matter. It basically wrote about firefighting as a benefit, that we have publicly funded firefighting. You live in your house in an area with extreme fire, but you don't have to pay for that firefighting. We all pay for that firefighting. And if those costs were put sort of more accurately on those homeowners, there might not be so many people living there. So that's not California specific, but I think it's a real factor about what's going on here. I think that a lot of people who move to those communities because they were more affordable are going to find themselves not really able to afford those communities. And there could be a reasonable housing policy, if California could ever get there, that would try to coax those people back to urban areas, which would be good for the climate in a whole bunch of ways.
So I think we'll go to audience questions soon. I'm sorry, did I cut somebody off there?
I was going to add that when we think about climate change and environmental change and livelihoods, migration is an adaptation response. It's a way of coping. And wealthy countries tend to provide more options to adapt in place. And that's what Abram and Liz are describing here in California and Florida. And this is not unique to the United States, although the United States and its insurance structure is a pretty extreme example relative to some, say, Western European countries. But until that policy kind of gets turned on its head, we shouldn't expect migration as an adaptation response at any sort of scale in the United States. It's going to take that kind of coaxing as long as we keep the policies that are in place there to reinforce the incentive to stay put.
So I thought I'd do a fun thing which we have not practiced, so we'll see how this goes, which is the following. I'd like to ask all three of our panelists to pretend that they were at the presidential debate tonight and they get one climate question. Why don't you go ahead and ask it, and then we'll open up to audience questions. What would you ask the two candidates if you could be on that stage with Chris Wallace and you get your one shot? I don't know, Abram, you've been at this so long. I'll start with you.
I mean, I think I'd want to hear what's the candidate's personal sense of urgency or understanding about the crisis that faces us, and what's the first thing that they're going to do to enact, some kind of large scale response, and and not a sort of piecemeal response.
How about you, Brian?
I would ask specifically about willingness to engage in international cooperation and to promote international policies that actually have some teeth behind them. Right? The big drawback of the Paris Agreement was that there was really no enforcement mechanism. This is not a problem that any one country is going to solve on its own. It's going to require international cooperation and engagement with the broader international community. So I would really focus on that aspect of the problem.
Liz.
All right. I think I would ask if and how they have a plan to get us to a saner place economically relative to all sorts of climate disasters. How would they fund prevention and mitigation before the disaster occurs, as opposed to waiting to spend a fortune once it's happened?
All good questions. Sorry, none of them will be asked, but perhaps in another debate they will. So perhaps we could go to our audience and see what they want to know.
Okay. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We've gotten a couple of questions about agriculture. One was emailed in advance, another one's here live. So the question from Rick and JW, how will climate change affect agriculture? Will climate change favor hyper-local regenerative farming over industrial complexes? Will farming move indoors as it has in New Zealand? Who can speak to this?
I can take a stab at that. I think it's a young conversation, but if you look at where large scale industrial farming happens in the United States, it's across the Midwest, which is, where we grow our big commodity crops, which are staple ingredients for a lot of processed foods and also drive a lot of United States agricultural exports. Our climate data suggests that crop yields across that region are going to drop dramatically, that, what happened in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl is very likely to happen again, or perhaps be worse. So I think you'll see a real decline in that kind of large scale industrialized agriculture in that region. And then you look at where our fruits and vegetables in this country come from, and they basically come from the desert in the Southwest, from Arizona and Southern California, and places where the availability of water is both extremely limited and artificially supplied. And those things have to, at some point, change. And so as that changes, I don't think there's clear answers yet on what new form of agriculture will look like in the United States, but I do agree with the person who asked that, you're more likely to see a growth in individual farming and smaller farms, and an increasing, food supply or crop supply coming from the north, northwest, and northeast. And some of our data suggests that crop yields, putting aside questions of soil quality, for example, but crop yields across the North Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, might increase just as much as they'll decrease further south. So there'll be a shifting opportunity.
Our next question comes from Yasmin. Can you speak more on the intersection between race and climate change in the US? She says some discussion of bluelining would be helpful. Anyone can speak to that?
Sure. I mean, so bluelining is a term that came up in my reporting from an architect and urban planning expert who was looking at this migration question in the United States with me. And it's an evolution of the racist practice of redlining, and essentially suggests that banks, lenders will begin to evaluate properties based on their climate risk, in much the same way that they subjectively evaluated lending based on someone's racial identity. But the two things build on one another, because we're finding now that many places that are at the greatest climate risk happen to be the same places that were redlined in the past, and it's no accident. Some of these places, for example, received the least investment in flood infrastructure over the past couple of decades because they were discriminated against for their racial makeup. And now that underinvestment in flood infrastructure, for example, has left them increasingly vulnerable to climate change. So you're seeing a sort of building, of threats. But that's really, largely a middle class conversation. And if you want to look at places where climate change has really already had dramatic effect, across this country, it's in the South, it's in the coast of Louisiana and parts of Georgia, coastlines that are already inundated by sea level rise. And there, the sort of disproportionate discriminatory effects of climate, are already well established. It's not, something for the future. It's, you already see, a real brunt of these changes being assumed by, Black, minority, indigenous communities in the Southeast. And that's kind of the writing on the wall, I think, for the rest of us as the problem grows and expands.
Next question comes from—
Well, hang on, if I might. I'd like to let Liz jump in here, because I think there's a sort of subtle contradiction which is worth talking about, which is that Liz had suggested earlier quite correctly that we have kind of cockeyed incentives that cause people to live in certain places. Abram, you said, but if we change the incentives, it has a disparate racial impact. So how do you change the incentives? I mean, is there a conversation, Liz, that you're aware of, say, in California, about changing the incentives but not having this kind of disparate racial impact? Is that something that's even in the conversation?
Not a conversation I've heard yet. It would obviously be a really interesting and important conversation. But I haven't heard that yet. But the same things Abram is mentioning, I was doing some reporting in the Eastern Coachella Valley where these issues were all layering on top of each other, where you have migrant populations who are working outside and it's 125 degrees. And the same people who are feeling the hard parts of living in this country and in the world, they're just going to feel all of this more. And there's not even the bandwidth to talk about climate change when you're trying to find somewhere to live, you're worried about going to the doctor, just all of the same things we talk about already.
Because there is a very famous ProPublica data map that actually appears in almost every story we do on certain subjects. And that is the map. If you start with where were the plantations in America in 1860, and that's a map that sort of goes across the South in a crescent. Then you say, who are the people who are the most audited for their taxes? I kid you not, it's the same people. who lacks health care, who has the highest rate. Every sort of thing that we investigate follows a rough pattern, and that same pattern was visible in the map, Bron, that you flashed earlier of the people who are going to have to move. So Brian, how do we deal with racial justice while the climate is demanding an uneven sort of application of migration? Can we do that? How do we do that as a society?
It's a very difficult thing to envision, given again the relationship between wealth and adaptation, and ultimately those segments of the population that are best suited to deal with the implications of climate change in the short term are those that have enjoyed the economic benefits of living in this or other wealthy countries for a long period of time, and these are generally primarily white populations, primarily living in communities that have enjoyed benefits that others have not. And increasingly, I think you're going to start to see these disparities play out in terms of population distributions across coastlines, for example, where historically in a city like Miami, the beachfront property has been more valuable than any other. But you're starting to see a shift where land that is further inland at slightly higher elevation is actually gaining value relative to beachfront property in anticipation of what's coming, which has the impact of forcing already disadvantaged populations out, a sort of climate gentrification, if you will. And it's hard to see market mechanisms taking care of this problem on their own without any sort of policy intervention. And therein, I think, is where state and local governments in particular are better suited to act in the near term to make sure that, for example, discriminatory real estate practices are not allowed to take root. I hesitate to put too much emphasis on federal policy at this point, given the lack of ability to craft any sort of meaningful legislation related to this phenomena. So I do think this is a very local issue.
Thank you.
But a fascinating one. I'm sort of thinking that once we get done with this conversation, we reporters and editors at ProPublica should sit down and begin thinking about how to cover the intersection of racial justice and climate change, which really sounds like, it's actually a brilliant question, Cynthia. Whoever said it, thank you very much. It's really a question that I think has not yet begun to be explored.
We see it play out in New York City, in terms of the relationship between problems like childhood asthma, the location of polluting or emitting facilities, and low income or racial and ethnic minority populations. So these issues of environmental justice are not new, and as the climate phenomena develops, we're seeing the exact same patterns emerge, and it's troubling.
And the conversation is getting a lot more robust, Steve. You'll be happy to know. The Sunrise Movement is really gaining a lot of traction. The youth intersection with the climate movement is really pushing these issues forward. So while I think there hasn't been a lot of policy intervention yet, I think the conversation is getting a lot louder and more sophisticated.
Our next question comes from Christian, and this is for Brian. Can you speak more about the definition of climate migrant, especially as it relates to your model's claims about the scenarios of climate migrants coming from Central America to the US? And Christian also asked, what is helpful about modeling climate migration for policy? Like, who do you want to see your model?
Okay, sure. So the climate migration, or the definition of a climate migrant, is a really tough question and a very good point. So I'm glad this was brought up, in that there is no widely accepted uniform definition of who is a climate migrant. A lot of people that researchers, for example, might label a climate migrant. If you were to actually go speak to some of these individuals, they would not share or they would not agree with that definition. They might, for example, consider themselves economic migrants, and it's only after environmental conditions deteriorated to the point that their livelihoods were no longer tenable that they chose to make a move, but they're making the move in response to what are ultimately economic stimuli. This is problematic for a number of reasons, not least of which is, in the absence of any sort of definition, it's difficult for us to, through international bodies like the United Nations, routinely identify someone who may, in fact, in the future be considered a refugee. and qualify for the special protections that refugees are afforded. But getting back to the definition, what we did in our modeling is we ran counterfactual scenarios in which we assumed that no climate change took place. That is, we held climatic conditions constant at where they are now. And we looked at the difference across all segments or all drivers, including economic drivers. So for example, when we hold climate constant, as opposed to allowing it to evolve, we find that there are fewer migrants who are forced out by certain economic factors. But because it's climate driving changes to the local economy that eventually forces people out, we actually did in our work ascribe those migrants to climate phenomena. So it was by running counterfactuals that we actually classified one as a climate or non-climate migrant. The second part of the question related to, what kind of audience would we like to see? Certainly, the goal of this kind of work is to begin the policy conversation, particularly as it pertains to international movement in the region Abram and I investigated in Central America and across the southern U.S. border. The issue does not have to be a crisis. We should not be concerned about a flood of migrants at the border if we are anticipating and preparing for the situation that is likely to evolve. And there are many ways where properly planned, the phenomena can actually be somewhat beneficial, both to sending countries and receiving countries like the United States, where we certainly are going to have shortfalls in certain sectors of the labor market. So this is designed to try and catch the attention of policymakers, get important conversations started, more so than anything, because the numbers themselves, well, important to understand the potential scope and scale of the issue, there's a lot of uncertainty around them. And it's really more important that we understand the potential implications of what might be coming so that we can do our best to make something positive and beneficial out of a situation that unfortunately has been classified as potentially catastrophic or at least a crisis.
Abram, I actually want to let you sort of jump in here for a moment, because part of the work that we did on this subject was mathematical, but part of it was also journalistic. So you have met and profiled some of the people who are thinking about migrating. How do you think about the question of what makes a climate migrant from what you learned?
Yeah, I mean, as Brian described, the economic factors, safety factors, and environmental factors can layer upon one another, and they can produce an outcome, which might be that someone decides to move. And, I found in my reporting that people who might not have typically been described as climate migrants had such a strong sort of climate DNA in their decision-making process that I would describe them as, as climate migrants. So, for example, we have enormous migratory pressure from El Salvador to the United States, and that migratory movement is typically sort of classified as the result of violence. We have, gang violence. That is pushing a lot of people out of El Salvador and towards the United States. And I met one woman who profiled in my story, for example, who is a victim of gang violence and repeated crime in San Salvador, and she's looking now to move to the United States. But you spend a little bit of time and talk to her, and find that she would vastly, prefer to return to the little village on the Guatemalan border where she grew up, but she can't because they don't have any water, and her family farms there and can't farm and can't grow any food, and she needs to be able to send them some money to buy food. And so ultimately her displacement from the land that would sustain her and many people like her, is a climate driven phenomenon. And so that's the way that you start to see sort of the subtle fingerprints of climate on issues that might appear to be something different. And that's the way that Brian's modeling tries to tease out what some of the driving factors are, but it's an underlying theme across the board. Others that I interviewed in Guatemala and spent time with, their situations were much more explicit. They couldn't grow food. It was unlike anything that was known in their family for generations, and they were acting out of sheer desperation. They were just looking for the most practical place to move to, where they could find jobs or find money enough to send home and feed their kids. But absolutely, they were responding explicitly to environmental change.
Liz, have we seen anyone in California yet who could be described as a climate migrant, or is that in the future?
I think that's very much in the present. I think that there are, just like we were talking about, there are people who live in the wildland urban interface and their insurance got dropped or their insurance got jacked up and they moved. There's a tremendous amount of casual conversation, I'm sure Bram can attest to this, among Californians these days of just the smoke is too bad, it's too hot, this place is not feeling like we thought this place was going to feel. We can't enjoy and live our lives here in the way that we thought we were going to. And those conversations aren't yet at the, climate migrant level, but it's the same factors. It's people talking about moving in response to what the climate is doing.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, let's see, so many, comes from Joseph. How do the California wildfires compare and contrast with the wildfires we saw in Australia a year ago? These the same thing? Are they different?
I wish I felt qualified to answer this question. I'm new to climate reporting. I don't have an answer. Maybe one of you do.
I mean, I could take a stab because no one else is jumping in. Also not my area of expertise, but I think what they have in common, are hotter conditions, longer dry seasons, greater fuels driven by less regular rainfall patterns. So you have years of drought punctuated by, years of intense rainfall. And what you get is a surge in growth of brush, which becomes fuel when it dries out again. And so that irregularity plus higher winds and more heat is just leading to the potential for not just more fires, but fires that spread faster and become much, much larger, even in places where burning has always been a part of the natural landscape.
I'll tell you what I do know on this issue, which is Australia responded to their wildfires in 2009 in a much more robust policy way than the United States has been responding to fires here, and California has been responding to fires here. So they had a horrible wildfire season. They had a huge royal commission looking into everything, and then they made big changes. And the number of fire experts I talked to last week who brought this up, who said, Australia had this situation, they studied it, they took action. We haven't done that. That is very much on people's minds.
I mean, I will point out, although I'm neither a California nor Australia expert, for 5 years I was a managing editor of the Oregonian, and I think this was from 2003 to 2008. And during my time in Oregon, the annual summer wildfire season was a little bit like the baseball season. You assign some reporters to go travel somewhere, and there was a lot of fire, and there was this sort of small sadness that places people occasionally knew caught on fire, but it didn't affect daily life in Portland. You didn't sit there and go, well, wow, this is like, this was just like an annual event. It's fire season again, and we got to get the fire team together, and here we go. This year, my friends in Portland tell me they're in the same position as you see at Brom, behind closed windows, unable to go out, unable to bicycle, unable to hike. And the Oregon that they thought they were going to live in for the rest of their lives may not be there if this happens every year. And that seems to me to be what happened to Australia. They'd always had fires, but suddenly the big cities were basically shutting down. And I'm not sure even the 2009 thing has saved them, right? Because the most recent fires were, a year ago? So they're not there yet, are they, Brian?
No, not yet. And again, I can speak to, fire is not my area of expertise in terms of the biophysical processes, but there have been several recent studies that suggest that it's important that we not only keep an eye on longer, more intense periods of heat and drought, but also the underlying patterns of spatial change in the population, in large part because we have here in the United States and in Australia been both migrating towards places that are dangerous, but also the natural pattern of population growth in both countries, albeit slow compared to other parts of the world, is such that we would expect just demographic change alone to more than double the number of people at risk under the projected fire regime by the mid-century point, 2050, so 30 years out from now. if we do not do something to change the way that we incentivize residential choice. So this is not a problem that's going to go away if we are not intervening.
So we're seeing a number of questions from people, living in California or the West who are thinking about moving, and they want to move. And I know your model suggests a couple of the best places. And also, maybe more broadly speaking, someone asked, like, what regions in the US are, and the wording of this question is a little strange, the relative winners in climate change and which are the relative losers and why? So like, what are sort of the worst places to live and what are the best places to move?
Sure. So this question is like, you know, the 900 of them in my email inbox now too. You know, so to be clear, you know, we didn't model where people will move to and from in the United States the way Brian and I tried to examine internationally, in part for the reasons we've described. It's really hard to predict. But the data that we did use to map in the United States is modeled to project the actual climate change into the future. And if you overlap that, those maps I showed earlier, you know, you kind of get a sense of you know, the walls closing in on the US. So you have fire pressure coming from the West and you have heat pressure coming from the South and, you know, and crop yield pressure coming from the South and right up, you know, through the Midwestern part of the country. And you know, and sea level rise pressure across the eastern seaboard and down to Florida. And so what you have left, you know, the negative space left by those maps is, you know, the place that I would look for, you know, where opportunity lies. And that's not a foolproof methodology, but it's a starting point. So, you know, the Pacific Northwest is going to be relatively sheltered, as will, you know, across the northern part of the country, across the Canadian border. The Great Lakes look like a pretty attractive place, and so do northern parts of the Northeast, Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, away from the coastlines. You know, whether you have other different sorts of problems arise that are, you know, next level problems in those places, water availability, pollution, spread of disease, airborne disease, for example, from, you know, insect pattern changes in insect migration. Those are all kind of problems that could affect those regions as well. But just, you know, on the basis of the criteria that we used, those are the parts of the country that look more attractive for the long-term future going forward.
Next question. Oh, go ahead.
Let me just add to that. I think that was a really nice kind of review of the situation. I think there are some clear losers, in particular, coastal locations, those areas that are already prone to drought, like the desert Southwest, that are projected to see more in the way of drought and intense heat. It can be tough to put a finger on who's a winner. You know, a lot of people have said Russia stands to gain quite a bit, and particularly parts of Siberia as the climate warms up. But look what's happened there in the past few years. There's been some unexpected results of warming in terms of the fires that have exploded across not only parts of northern Russia, but northern Scandinavia. It's very hard to anticipate how ecosystems that have enjoyed relative climate stability for a very long time are going to react when all of a sudden everything is thrown into flux. So certainly, while we can say that inland locations or locations like the Pacific Northwest, I would agree with the Brahms assessment there, are more likely than others to be winners. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that question, at least on the side of where are things going to be okay or improve. Certainly, there are locations we can point to and say these are going to be problematic.
Our next question is from Benjamin. He says, hasn't there always been climate migration? And also, what can we do to accommodate climate migrants?
Yes, there has always been climate migration. And just like, yes, there has always been climate change, both on the global scale and the hyper-local scale. So migration in response to environmental conditions is nothing new. This has been happening throughout the existence of the human species. What's different now is the scope and scale. The speed with which we are seeing change occur is unlike anything we've seen in the past, with maybe the exception of a few local situations where there was catastrophic short-term sudden onset change. But we've never seen anything with the kind of geographic reach that we're seeing now. So the type of climate migration we're talking about just exceeds any sort of evidence or anecdotal evidence that we can point to in the past in terms of what we expect going forward. And therein lies the real big and important difference.
And at the same time, affecting a larger population than ever before.
Right.
And does anyone have thoughts on how climate migrants can be sort of accommodated, or what policy sort of solutions are there for that?
You see countries like Germany, like Japan, like the United States that perhaps aren't as likely to be hard hit in the near term, but particularly when we're talking about countries in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Japan would qualify. These are countries that have a demographic crisis in terms of what their labor pool looks like going forward. They're aging. They've got an increasingly a growing dependency ratio, that is portion of the population that is not working and is dependent on the working age population for support. And it's very clear that the German economy, for example, will not survive in its current form without immigration. They are simply not creating enough children in Germany to make up for those exiting the labor pool on the 65 plus end. So I think there are tremendous opportunities there to take advantage of the fact that humans are going to need to reorient the way they've been distributed across the planet for countries that are in need of certain types of migrants to plan for this. And Germany is just one example, but if the world is preparing and is doing so in a cohesive fashion, there will be many opportunities for us to take advantage of the economic implications of the large-scale movement of people from country to country or within countries.
I mean, if you look at American history, we have been I think, arguably largest beneficiary of this. You have a potato famine in Ireland. Suddenly, many Irish people migrate for what amounts to a sort of climate health reason and find themselves in the United States. The late 19th century droughts in Italy peopled literally Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. And we could go on and on and on. I mean, right? We have had a historic huge benefit from the influx of migrants, many of whom were driven by climate. And in fact, the case, I would argue, the state of California is built upon the notion that you couldn't grow anything in Oklahoma in the middle of the country, and people migrated for climate reasons to there in the first place.
I just want to jump in that, what we do next to seize or not seize that opportunity is, according to all of the reporting I've done over the course of these stories, is really, determinative of the future. And there's a couple, routes that could go. And the first is potentially dark. It's that, the kind of migration and population movement that we're seeing now around the world is trending towards, provoking a more protectionist, kind of isolationist viewpoint in receiving countries. And while we might have the opportunity to benefit from allowing migrants in, we're not doing that, and the West isn't typically doing that. And you see that in the catalyst for the Brexit vote in the UK, or in Italy's response to migrants coming across the Mediterranean. India is building a wall along the border of Bangladesh. We are trending towards keeping people out, which will divide societies more, and according to Brian's model and a lot of our work, deepen poverty in some of those host places. And the UN warns then will lead to deepening chaos and instability, the likes that we see in the Syrian conflict, for example, which has a climate and environmental driven component to it. The other big takeaway is that in order to seize some opportunity, preparation is mandatory. And you see that whether we're talking about international borders and migrants or domestic migrants, in the United States. But the one sort of repeated takeaway from every single conversation I have is that whether this phenomenon proves to be disruptive and destabilizing, or a source of growth and new opportunity, depends on what cities in particular or receiving areas do to prepare, whether we have adequate infrastructure, adequate economy to provide jobs, adequate healthcare to support a large and growing population, and its lack of preparation for that demographic change that leads to the worst and most destabilizing global and domestic effects.
Okay, our next question is from Elizabeth. There's a few questions like this. Can the panelists speak to the impact of climate change, specifically fires and wildfires, on the wildlife population, particularly those that impact the livelihoods of, people who fish, tourism, and that sort of thing. So the effect of wildlife.
It's a huge effect. I mean, just as humans are moving out of all of these areas, ecosystems are getting destroyed at an alarming rate. There are a lot of environmental groups participating in lawsuits in lots of different ways that get into just the nitty gritty of where we're going to live. If you put this development here in this place, you will increase the wildfire risk. And therefore, these plant species that I care about or these animal species will be at greater risk. So it's an integral part of it.
I would just add to that. I mean, it's while wildfires have been a historic part of the cycle in places like California or Colorado, they haven't forests haven't always regenerated in the conditions that we have now or will have into the future. And so one of the big open questions is, as the Sierra Nevada mountains in California burn or the foothills of the Rockies burn, that you might not have in the future as those burned areas come back, the kind of forests that we're accustomed to or that wildlife are accustomed to or that tourists go there to seek out. It's not really clear what will be there, but it could be an entirely different landscape, more of scrub and rock than great forests.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I'd like for Steve to close out the panel. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Stephen.
Well, I guess it's the overhanging question in all of this, which I'd love to hear the panelists' individual opinions on. All of you have described a world of sort of impending danger and of increasingly loud signals. What do you think it will take for us as a species to get it? And do you think we will get it in time? Small question. Fire away.
I'll start. I mean,
Liz, go ahead.
As with a great many things about climate, a lot of the questions are not, what do we do? What would be a good thing to do? It's how do we get to the point where we actually do them? And I think the pain that we're feeling right now, as much as it's difficult, at least is going to inch us closer. And I think the amount of money relative to wildfire, again, that we're spending fighting fires is getting so extreme that perhaps we're inching closer to saying, let's move some of that money over to prevention. The medicine analogy is really strong, that preventative measures are far more economical than what we're doing right now. So I think the pain points will move us closer.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think we're at a tipping point in terms of public consciousness. And, as you see broader swaths of the population, especially the American population, have direct experience and feel their own lives interrupted by wildfires or hurricanes or whatever the case is, this becomes less, climate change becomes less of a political or philosophical issue and becomes much more of a pocketbook issue and a family issue. And as that happens, that's the real wake-up call. But the second part of your question, in some sense, it's already too late. And it's not too late to to stop the worst effects, but we are late to making the changes to ward off the transformation that's already begun and is underway. And so, I think there's plenty of opportunity to lessen how bad it gets, to lessen that impact going forward. And, you can't overstate the urgency of really dramatic reforms now in terms of our, global emissions and national emissions. But unfortunately, that first wake up call, that alarm went off, a long time ago.
And that last point's an important one, right? We're heading to uncharted territory almost regardless of what we do right at this moment, which again, that should not be mistaken as an excuse to do nothing. We are locked into a certain level of climate change that is going to take the human species outside of this relatively narrow band of environmental conditions that we've existed in throughout our history. So we are going to see something entirely different if you will, over the next 40 to 50 years. And what that looks like is still an open question. I think the economic answer that Abram and Liz gave us is the correct one. When this starts to really affect the bottom line, we tend to react. It's not an accident that when you look at public opinion polls in election years, that the economy is always at the top of the list of concerns. And when climate begins to really have an economic impact, I think we act. An important piece of that, though, that doesn't get discussed enough, in my opinion, is income inequality. And the more concentrated wealth is in the hands of a few, I think the slower we are going to be to act, because those that are controlling the means of production have so much wealth that they are insulated against the issue and will be slower to react. Conversely, the more disposable income that is distributed across households, not just in this country, but globally, the freer we become to act individually. There are a lot of people out there who would like to do something to change their lifestyle, to contribute to solving the problem, but they're simply not able to because of economic constraints in their own lives. So enabling people to make the kind of change that's necessary does, in my opinion, necessarily involve enabling them to economically make these kinds of changes. So solving the income inequality issue is part and parcel to solving the climate problem.
Okay, and that is our time for today. This event has been recorded, by the way, and you can view it on ProPublica's YouTube channel. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for all of you for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Bye.